Hello, this is Think for Yourself, an introduction to critical thinking, a short little online course. My name is Mark Thorsby, and if you'd like to follow along, this is the book we're using, a workbook for arguments by David Morrow and Anthony Weston. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you've been following along with the series. If you've been following along, then you know that the series is organized as a set of rules that we should use and apply in both our evaluation of arguments as well as the making of our own arguments. And so these sort of rules sort of apply to general good solid thinking. Today we're going to be taking a look at Rule 5 and Rule 5. Build on substance, not overtone. And this is an obvious point on the one hand, but on the other hand, you'd be surprised how frequently the tone, the style, the emotionally charged language that people use in their arguments can oftentimes really throw us off our guard, or more importantly, it becomes difficult to carry on an authentic, engaged discussion about something, or to think about something clearly. So you have to build on the substance of the ideas, not the overtone. And in a certain way, there's, again, both the evaluation, but it's also the way in which we write our arguments in particular. So one of the ways we can begin to understand this is to understand that there's a difference between reason and rhetoric. Reason ultimately refers to and this is not an official definition, but we can say that reason refers to statements that we use, that we think with, that infer or provide evidence for a given claim or a set of claims, right? So reason refers to the process whereby we're making inferences, we're laying down statements, propositions that are either true or false, and then if they're true, then we lay another proposition that links it to the first, and so on and so forth, up until we get to our conclusion. So you could think of it that way, that arguments are sort of like chains of inference. They get linked together. Now, reason basically refers to that whole thing, whether it's deductive or inductive reasoning or whatnot. Rhetoric, by contrast, and again, there's people who spend their lives doing rhetoric, so I'm quite simplifying things in this video, but at the best, we could say that rhetoric is something like the art of effective persuasion, right? That is, for instance, remember that whenever you're communicating with someone, you communicate both the content of your ideas, but you do it through the form of your speech, right? Or the form of your writing or whatnot. So there's form and there's content. And in order to be a clear communicator, in order to make good arguments too, you have to know things about the world, right, that are true, that you're making arguments about. But you have to also state those arguments in a way that's logical and clear. So you can talk about the form versus the content, and rhetoric is very important in terms of the form of the arguments we make, because ultimately to be persuasive, things have to be clear, and that depends upon really, if you will, the organization of how we present our ideas, whether in this case, our short form arguments, but also in terms of longer form essays, or long form discussions, for instance. So if you will, but that's why the reason I say here is it's at best is because we can also say that rhetoric is sort of a spectrum on the one hand. On the one hand, and this is not an official sort of, law or anything like this. This is my way of understanding it. You might say that on the one hand of rhetoric is the reasonableness of the way in which we present our ideas and we persuade people. And we try to persuade people based upon things that are reasonable, first and foremost. But at the other end of the spectrum of the way in which we present our ideas, there comes into play the psychological. And here we're talking about the way in which the psychology of the mind, whether it be by tapping into people's emotions or whether it be through a certain organization, right, can be used in order to, on the one hand, get people to agree with you, or B, be unable to assess the argument because they've been misdirected by an emotional charged statement or something. And this is why what we're going to talk about here is loaded language. Now, this is, by the way, Plato, right, famously is very, very much opposed to rhetoric. In fact, Socrates in the Apology, at the very beginning of his speech, he says, listen, I'm not going to give you a beautiful set of lofty words here. I'm going to speak plainly. I'm going to speak clearly, because that's the truth. And so Plato is very suspicious of rhetoric because rhetoric has this ability when it's lofty to inspire. I mean, the beautiful things about great orations or great works of literature are that they do inspire us and that they do emotionally organize our intentions. Um, but ultimately, this can really become problematic when it's the reasonableness of things that matter, right? For instance, in ancient Athens, at one point in ancient Athenian history, right, the question was, how should we respond to this military threat? Right? Some argued that you should prepare militarily. Others argued that you should sacrifice to the gods and hope for the best. And that doesn't work out, right? So sometimes people can make arguments like they did in ancient Athens that are psychologically motivating, but they lack in their reasonableness. And I also think you could say that there's some arguments that are very reasonable, but they really lack a psychological emotional appeal. So there is a balance, I think, in rhetoric to presenting arguments that are effective and, if possible, beautiful, I think. But this means that what we got to be concerned about really is emotionally charged statements and emotionally charged language. Because ultimately, our emotions really get us to consent to things very easily because our emotions will overtake our reasonableness, our minds, the way in which we think about rationally things. Famously, David Hume was a great philosopher, and empiricist British philosopher, and one of the things that he discussed was what's the relationship between reason and passion. And most philosophers up to this point, Plato, for instance, would argue this, that ultimately the reason is at the core, and that emotions are something that are secondary. But David Hume suggested, and really was one of the first philosophers to take seriously the idea that maybe our passions, our emotional or psychological complexes and affairs, ultimately are driving the sorts of reasons that we accept or don't accept. And I think that one of the recognitions of modern contemporary philosophy is the recognition that emotionally charged language can be very difficult for the mind to overcome. So we really need to avoid using these statements. We need to watch out for them when arguments are presented to us. And one of the things that's interesting is I think that, for instance, now increasingly you're even seeing emotionally charged language in terms of also what's visually available. Think, for instance, if you're watching I don't know, one of these cable news shows on CNN or MSNBC or something, and imagine they're talking about some sort of political debate, and behind them is a picture of a flag sort of gleaming in the background, right? And you can see there that the usage of the flag is a symbolic usage that has a high emotional resonance with the audience. So ultimately, but it also has a patriotic emotional thing. And so you can see here that through the visual medium there, they're setting up a situation in which it does become difficult for people to disentangle their emotional affects towards the flag versus their emotional versus the emotional thing that, for instance, someone may arguing. What the guest might be arguing. So, what are some of the lessons we can use here based on this rule? One is I think we have to learn to spot emotionally charged language, loaded terms. Now, we should say here that some terms are loaded, but they're loaded because they're just presumptuous, and they're not emotionally presumptuous. They're conceptually presumptuous. So there is charged language in that sense, and we also need to avoid that. But in terms of this emotional question we've looked at here, we need to spot those emotions. Also, we need to recognize that there's both positive and negative emotional attachments that we can have to terms and words and ideas. Usually, someone will give positive emotional language if the goal of their argument is to convince you in favor of something. I mean, usually people use negative emotional language if they want you to disagree with something. So typically, but there is the difference here. And in a certain way, the negative terms, I think, are probably easier for us to spot. Why? Because they're negative. It's usually it's easy to see when someone's tone is indicating some sort of a negative sort of emotion, and they're trying to get you to also have that emotion. The positive ones are not always as difficult to spot simply because if they're positive, it's likely we already agree with the emotional framing of their idea. So you got to watch out for both, though, right? I think it's okay to have. I think there's a time and there's a place to write about emotions, right? But when you're making these short form arguments that we've sort of been looking at here, these arguments need to be clear and concise. Um, and you need to avoid these sort of short terms. The context always matters, of course, is the other thing, because the emotional discharge or the emotional impact of a statement depends upon the audience that's receiving it. So a lot of this can be cued in by taking a look at the context, and also when you're evaluating an argument, strip it of its context, of its emotional context in order to evaluate it. That's, I think, actually an important lesson that's often difficult for us because when we're presenting an argument, usually we're reading it because we're serious about it. And when we're reading it, there's a whole emotional context that we bring to the equation. And so we need to disentangle our own emotional attachments when we evaluate as well. So it's not always in the eye of it's not always the author's fault or the person who's making the argument. Sometimes the listener, too, who responds and brings the context to bear as well. So I think we have to be aware of that. Let's see here. Let's move here to my next little circle. So one of the things we might say if we're going to list things out just in a sort of simple format is, number one, remember when you're evaluating arguments, always apply the principle of charity. The principle of charity basically states that you're going to try to understand another person's argument in the best possible light that you can, which means that it's likely, assume for instance that they're making a serious argument. And if they are making a serious argument, ask yourself, what are their reasons and does this conclusion follow, right? And could this conclusion follow given other sets of premises? So you have to evaluate it in this hypothetical state. Now, once you've applied the principle of charity and you're beginning to evaluate the argument, you need to try to understand the reasons for making the argument. So, number one, recognize this emotionally charged language or presumptive language. Right? But don't just stop there. Recognize that the argument has a deficiency, but you can also still learn from people's arguments by taking a look at the types of emotional attachments or the emotional um, colorings that they add to their work. For instance, evaluate the possible reasons for the emotional discharge here, right? Why is it that, what are the assumptions, for instance, that they're making about you as a reader? And what sort of context are they assuming or presuming there? Given those sorts of reasons, you may be able to even think through what their real reasons might be. Of course, if you're actually discussing with someone, you should ask them point blank. You said, for instance, that these people are idiots. What do you mean by idiots, for instance? Right? Imagine if someone's having a conversation, they say, all the politicians are idiots, right? Stop someone and ask, what do you mean by idiot? What qualifies someone as being an idiot? You can see that most people, when they're, especially in a political debate, most people are highly emotionally attached, right? And then, because basically what you want to do is you want to respond to the argument, the reasons that are given, and really importantly, you want to avoid the loaded language yourself. So don't respond in kind with emotionally charged language, right? For instance, if you go to YouTube, right, take a look at sort of any sort of posting, and sometimes you'll see people will make really derogatory or incendiary or somehow crazy comments, and then people will respond with emotionally charged language, right? And it actually can cultivate this sort of cycle of emotional, non-reasonable fighting, really. I mean, it's really sort of tragic and sad. So one of the things that happens there is that we can easily get trapped into it and hooked in. So you have to, like Mr. Spock here, you have to really suspend your emotional judgments when you're evaluating arguments seriously and when you're making arguments as well. Okay? Let's see here. Do I have anything else? Yes, let me give you one quick example. For instance, take a look at this argument. Someone says, and this comes from the chapter book that we're following here. So I can't seem to get this thing to. There we go. Oh well, never mind. Certain irresponsible American politicians have been spewing lies about the latest attempts at reform. Whether these lies come from a combination of stupidity and hysterical imagination, or from cleverness and a willingness to exploit innocent Americans for personal political gain, these lies must be exposed for the damaging falsehoods that they are. Right? So take that argument. Clearly, it's negative and it's completely laced with negative imagery and words that have a negative emotional attachment, right? So, first off, take a look here. The first thing is notice when people start saying things like spews lies, right? Okay, so now we're saying that they're liars, right? Now remember, maybe some American politicians who are irresponsible are liars, right? But look what happens when you continue. Whether these lies, right there it is again, come from a combination of stupidity and hysterical imagination, or from cleverness and a willingness to exploit. So we have a language of exploitation. We have basically name calling here, calling these people stupid, or people are hysterical. Right? You can see that this entire argument is really meant to force you emotionally to agree with them, because you can see here, if most people would never admit to the idea that they think that politicians should be lying, and that, right, would they disagree that stupid politicians are irresponsible, right? All of the language is emotionally negative in a way that compels a person psychologically to agree. And that doesn't make any sense. You have to look at the actual argument. So first off, spot the emotional language. Then ask yourself, for instance, okay, what's their real conclusion here? What is the takeaway? What is it that they want me to believe, right? And it looks like, I think the final sort of passage here is this final statement is the conclusion, where they say lies must be exposed for the damaging falsehoods that they are, right? So you can see here, wait a second, they're saying that the lies need to be exposed. Well, if the lies are not exposed, then how do we know that they're a liar, right? You can see here that we presumed it. So you have to diagnose the loaded language there and then evaluate it accordingly. Okay? Thank you very much for watching. Think for yourself. I'll see you guys next time with Rule 6.